In this session, we'll focus on commitment 5, which says that a strong church is developing an increasingly godly, diverse, and competent leadership core. My mentor in ministry is a man named Robert Cupp, and he told me, and when I went out to plant my very first church, he said, focus on the development of your leadership core. As your leadership core goes, so goes your church. And that was such a helpful true north for me as I went out to ministry, and it served me until this very day. And it's really never proven to be anything other than true. And so we really want to talk about that. We want to talk about what your leadership core looks like in this commitment. We want to talk about how it's moving forward as you pursue the mission in your city. One thing I'll say about my point of view on leadership development is that with the right environment and a consistent attentiveness, people can grow up. That's the good news. People can grow to maturity. They can grow to be both more godly and more competent in the gifts that God's given them for the advance of the kingdom. So, that's a hopeful thing. Like, people can change and grow. People can be better than they were last year. In fact, often I'll do this with leaders where I'll start a development plan with them and I'll say, hey, this time next year, you will be a stronger, more godly leader. Let's just reverse engineer that outcome. Let's just figure out what we need to do now to make that statement true. And I've seen when we have a plan, when we're committed to it, when we're attentive and there's some of the right environmental factor in place, we see people grow up. In fact, we often see them grow beyond what even our expectations would have been with the investments that we make. So I really want to give you that hope as we go. I want to encourage you to think about your leadership core. Think about how deep it is. And by deep, I mean how deep and mature are the people? How formed are they in Christ? How much are they in love with Jesus and communing with Jesus? And is their ministry flowing out of that depth? And how competent are they with their hands? Do they know how to do the work of ministry in the area that God has gifted them, or that the area the ministry really needs from them in the season? And both of those matter, and we want to put equal time to both. And so one thing I want to say about leadership development, and it's really a comment about churches and just observing lots of churches over many years. I'll say this, it's not everybody spends time on it. In fact, there's some barriers that get in the way of churches spending time on leadership development. But I'm going to start with what's not a barrier. Time is not actually a barrier in leadership development. If you're not developing leaders in your church, it's not because you don't have time. Time is purely about priority. If something's important to you, you find time to do it. When I was dating my wife, Caroline, and I was busy in seminary and I had late night papers and had a lot of responsibilities, somehow I found time to have a date with Caroline. It was important to me. I was very busy. I was working a full-time job. I was taking a full load of school. Somehow Caroline was still a priority. I made time for the things that were important to me. The same is true with leadership development. So time is really not a barrier. We'll find a way to develop leaders if we're passionate about seeing the leadership core grow in our churches. Money's not really a barrier. In fact, I've seen some small churches that develop leaders almost more intentionally than some larger churches who might hire new staff, hire new leaders from elsewhere and not spend a lot of time doing internal development. So the amount of money you have in your church is really not a factor in whether or not you do or don't develop leaders. Another barrier would be size. You say, hey, our church isn't big enough, and so I don't have time or the staff capacity to develop leaders. And that's not true either. We know that Jesus made disciples and developed his men in intimacy, actually. That the 12 were with him in all of life, and they got to see him, who he was, how he communed with the Father, and how he made disciples in so many different circumstances. And so size is really not a problem. You can develop people at any size of church. And some would even argue, as Tim Keller has, that him cutting his teeth in a smaller church in rural Virginia gave him more ministry exposure than had he been in a large church and had to specialize really early on. And so a small church might actually be an even better environment for developing holistic leaders. And so don't let size discourage you. One thing that is a barrier, okay, and this is probably the biggest barrier in why a church will or won't make a big investment in leadership development, that's conviction. Maybe we don't yet believe that this is one of the most critical parts of our vocation. Maybe we've lost sight of Ephesians 4, which says that our job is to equip the saints for the work of ministry, not do the ministry for them. And so we're not giving yet the convictional emphasis to this important commitment. Another one would be poor self-leadership. If I'm running too fast and I'm constantly behind and trying to pull off Sunday and just always a little behind, yeah, I don't necessarily carve out time to make long-term investments, to really stop and be attentive to the leaders that are coming up. And so some self-management and some personal time management, blocking strategic long-term development time into my calendar and not letting it get squeezed out by more urgent concerns is really a key in whether or not a church will or won't, or whether you as a leader will or won't develop others for the work. Another barrier is fear or control. This idea that I can't really entrust others to do the work because they won't yet do it as well as I could do it, and quality matters, and so therefore I'm never going to give anybody a rep or give them an on-ramp into getting to try and test things. But that's really, a barrier unless we work through that and start to say, you know what, this person's development is more important than nailing excellence in every single regard, every single time. It's almost like cooking with your kids. Yes, it's going to be a bigger mess. Yes, it's going to take more time, but the only way kids learn to cook is when mom and dad will slow down and actually do it with them. But when mom and dad do, you see, even in high school, some kids that are way far along in cooking than you would probably ever expect. Another barrier is what I might call the E-myth. So the E-myth is this idea that I work in the thing and never quite work on the thing. And that means for you, it might be preaching, or it might be pulling off, a missional community training, or it might be, mobilizing DNA groups. And yet we're not stepping back to say, how do we increase the capacity of the ministry, not just the maintenance of the ministry? And so we really need to know and even look at our schedule and our time in terms of where am I working in the church and where am I working on the church? And I encourage leaders all the time to block 2 to 4 hours a week, even if it's Friday afternoon, to stop and to think strategically about working on the church. And what could you do to increase the capacity, which often looks like developing the leadership core, expanding the number of leaders who can do more and advance the footprint of the overall work. I think it's really interesting the way that the Apostle Paul talks about leadership development in 2 Timothy 3. And he's talking to Timothy and he says this, he says, "Now Timothy, you followed my teaching, my conduct, my purpose, my faith, my patience, my love, my perseverance, even saw me in persecutions and suffering, and you saw it in Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra, and you saw the faithfulness of God through and through in all of those situations." So what he's saying is that his training of Timothy was not primarily just classroom. That would be teaching, right? Or even just teaching plus conduct, which would be kind of maybe the more traditional leadership development model, maybe even the seminary model, which would be, hey, we want to make sure you know sound doctrine and that you have some basic character in place to go and do the work. Paul gets into a lot more than that. He sees purpose in ministry. He sees someone needs a true north. They need to know what they're made to do in the kingdom. They need to have clarity about purpose. They need to have faith, which is more than just knowing things about God, and actually trusting God in the real world with real stuff and walking in mature faith. They need patience, okay? Anyone who's been in ministry for very long at all knows that waiting on God and waiting on His timing and trusting Him with delay is a part of the work. He says, you saw my love. 1 Timothy 1:5 says that the goal of our instruction is love, that the mark of maturity in the church is somebody who's mature in love. Even like Jesus, mature enemy love. As Jesus said, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they're doing." On the cross, He was mature in His love for even enemies. And so how can we make disciples of Jesus? How can we train the church if we aren't ourselves mature in love? And so Paul's saying, you saw that in me, Timothy. And it's critical. In perseverance, he went through trials and tests of many kind, and he persevered. That's critical to learn. And in persecutions and suffering. We might not want to hear that's a part of ministry, but Timothy got to see that before he ever had to lead in it. And there was no false advertising in Christian leadership. He actually watched Paul do that. And I love that he watched it in 3 different cities, because when we see things in different contexts, but maybe the same principle, we really gain a more robust understanding of what that is. It's like, hey, Paul's still the same guy, he's still persevering, but the circumstances are a little bit different. The faces and names in this town are a little bit different, but it's perseverance. And now I understand that more than I did before. But we want to think holistically about that. I'll say this, some leaders will spend a ton of time on a pedagogy and trying to build this super robust plan for how they're going to develop leaders. I found that a pedagogy, a training curriculum that's 80% good enough, that's vigorously pursued with a lot of attentiveness, is usually more than good enough. And the more integrated it is with your life, the less sterile and academic it is, almost the better. So just find ways to bring people with you. Take a plan and just start working it. Improve it on the fly. Don't go hide away for months and build some huge new curriculum. I just start to bring guys along, gals along, and involve them in the work. And know this, as I mentioned on the front, people can grow. As you do this, you're going to see your leadership core get deeper and wider. And as you see that, you're going to see the capacity of the church get deeper and wider. You're going to see yourself get to specialize more and more in the things that God's actually gifted you to do as you delegate more and more to the people who are more gifted than you are to do it. And the fruit of that is going to be a lot more disciples. It's going to be a lot more health. It's going to be the body properly functioning as God intends, and it's going to result in Christ's glory. I want to give you one challenge in this session, and it's going to be a stretch for some of you, but I want to challenge you for 1 month to actually chart your time and to spend as much time on leadership development as you do on Sunday. Anything, whatever it takes, sermon prep or worship leading or slide decks or whatever goes into your Sunday service. I want to challenge you for a month. Spend the exact amount of time on leadership development as you do on Sunday. It's going to do a couple things. It's going to show you how much time that feels like, first off, and you might say, wow, that takes some real effort, which is going to highlight the degree to which you are or aren't making a lot of time for leadership development. If you stay at that ratio over time, you're going to find that not only are your Sundays stronger, your missional communities are stronger, your DNA is stronger, the footprint of the leadership in your church will be stronger, and it'll be well worth the investment. In fact, I believe those that take that challenge and those that work that through are going to be the envy of those who don't. And people will come to you looking for the silver bullet. They'll try to understand, how are you guys doing this? And what's all this fruit that you're seeing? And you'll be able to point to something as simple as, we just took time to raise up others. We just took time to expand the base of our church. And now we're famous in our city for being a place that leaders come to be developed. And if you ever get that reputation in your city, the rich will get richer. When you get a reputation for development, more and more people come to get development, and you'll just keep rolling. And it'll really result in what I believe is a strong church and a strong witness, and it will result in glory to Jesus.